Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to APUSH. Today we're going to bring World War II to a close by talking about heavy combat in both the Pacific and the European theaters, laying out the conditions by which the Axis were defeated, and of course the role that Americans played in this. Here are your objectives for today. Unfortunately, as always, because this is, a push, we're not going to go into huge amounts of detail on the battles themselves. We're just going to try to give you a taste of what combat was like in the various theaters for the Americans who had to fight there, and then talk a little bit about how that affected the decision making going forward. So, one thing we hadn't talked about yet is the wartime conferences between the quote-unquote Big Three. We see here Joseph Stalin, FDR, King of America, and Winston Churchill. And so you should probably know the Tehran Conference, where they the Big Three sort of got together and helped organize strategy and things like that. You should probably know, the Dumbarton Oaks Conference, which helped set the stage for the United Nations and helped establish sort of the global financial system after the war. We had invited China to be part of this whole thing at that point. And so these wartime conferences sort of helped us. These wartime conferences helped organize strategy amongst the Allies and allowed them to coordinate their efforts somewhat better. Of course, the most famous conference is Yalta, but we'll talk about that in the context of the Cold War, because that really sort of sets up our lessons on the divisions in Europe and Asia. So, in the Pacific, the United States' basic strategy was island hopping. The Japanese had created a massive perimeter by taking and then reinforcing islands across the Pacific. They made these islands into spectacularly fortified fortresses with airfields on them, bunkers, underground tunnels, mines, pillboxes, spectacular defenses. And the strategy of the Japanese was to hopefully make these islands so unpleasant for the Americans to assault and take that the American Central Command would decide that it wasn't worth it, that the American public would lose faith in the war and trust that the Japanese were willing to suffer and die to a much larger extent than the Americans were willing to suffer and die, and that would lead to an eventual victory for Japan. The strategy of island hopping really overcame that Japanese strategy because a combination of using islands as jumping off points in order to take other islands. Once we took an island, generally we'd go in and build an airfield there and then use it as an assault point to take on the next island. And also the strategy of leapfrogging, specifically jumping over islands that were very heavily defended and trying to take on more tempting targets that were less heavily defended. This was an incredibly brilliant strategy because once the Japanese on these islands were cut off from resupply from the main Japanese islands, there was really nothing to keep the soldiers there alive. These islands were really too small to have massive amounts of supplies on. And so you just cut off these islands from any sort of resupply boats, and the Japanese there would eventually starve. It's a pretty brutal calculus, but it was incredibly effective at bypassing a number of these islands. And for the Japanese, they hated this because they're waiting for this attempt to go down in this sort of glorious defense of the homeland. And instead, their enemies are boredom and hunger. And the Americans never show up. It's a real interesting strategy that I didn't understand until the last couple of years here. Assaulting these islands was incredibly brutal. There's basically a number of different types of island assaults. Tarawa was a small, low-lying coral atoll. So here's an account of the bombardment of the island before we attempted to take it. So take a moment, pause, and read. After this bombardment, we'd then send in the amphibious landing craft, and it took a while to sort of perfect this style of amphibious assault because there's a real question. How far up do the amphitracts go? What happens if they hit coral reefs? How much are we going to risk these important military assets versus to what extent are we going to, risk American lives by having to wade through the water? And so the island of Tarawa, we made a ton of really, really bad choices. More or less, the amphitracts got caught up on coral reefs, and people had to jump into the water. The Marines had to jump into the water and often wade, for the span of a half to a half mile through water that was up to their waist while getting attacked by Japanese machine guns. It was incredibly brutal. The cost of taking the island of Tarawa was absolutely huge, and it led us to start redesigning some of our landing craft to be able to make sure that they could go over coral reefs, that they could get right up onto the beaches, that our Marines would not be exposed the way they were in the island of Tarawa. And the island of Tarawa, again, represents, the spectacular cost that Americans had to face in taking these islands. The fighting in the Pacific was incredibly brutal, and the Japanese, for the most part, fought almost to the last man, and that made it incredibly difficult to root them out of bunkers, caves, places like that. And so the death toll on these islands was spectacularly high. The Solomons campaign and the attack on the island of Guadalcanal represents a different type of combat for the Americans. Guadalcanal is a much larger island than a lot of the low-lying coral atolls that we talked about before. And so because it is very mountainous and jungly, fighting on Guadalcanal was much more like what you'd think of combat in Vietnam, where there's not really lines. You're not really trying to take enemy positions. It's more setting up a perimeter and then patrolling through the jungle, trying to find hidden enemy forces who are lying in wait for you. Generally, the Americans, the way this battle worked was both sides would deposit as many people on the island as possible. Generally, it's only about 10,000 soldiers on each side because the island is just too small to support much larger than that. The Americans would drop more soldiers and ammunition off during the day and would go on patrols through the jungle during the day. The Japanese would drop off more supplies and patrols at night and would assault during the nighttime. And so the battle was a day-night sort of affair in which Americans would march through the jungle during the day trying to root out the Japanese, and the Japanese would launch assaults at night with the goal being wear down your opponents, kill more of them than they could kill of you, sort of exhaust their ability to fight. And it was incredibly unpleasant and brutal. Plus, disease took a huge toll, and starvation took a huge toll, especially for the Japanese, who routinely struggled to feed and supply their troops. And so all of these things also made fighting in the Pacific incredibly unpleasant. Guadalcanal ended up being one of the turning points in the Pacific War because this is where the United States starts pushing back and taking islands back from the Japanese. The Japanese had set up on Guadalcanal in May, and American troops over the span of about 7 months were able to force the Japanese off the island, set up airfields there, and then use this Guadalcanal as a jumping off point to sort of start taking other islands. The Battle of Saipan is one of the battles that starts to show the differences in industrial capacity between the two sides. So the Battle of the Philippine Sea was a battle between Japanese military naval forces and U.S. naval forces. At this time, the U.S. was starting to churn out the new Essex-class aircraft carrier, these new incredibly armored aircraft carriers with sort of an armored flight deck on top. And American shipyards were turning out, dozens of these a year, whereas the Japanese were really struggling to even replace their planes, to even replace service vessels. And they had created a couple new aircraft carriers, but they were not innovating to the same extent the Americans were. And by the Battle of the Philippine Sea, American aircraft significantly outclassed Japanese aircraft to the point where the Japanese assault on the American forces in the Philippine Sea became known as the Marianas Turkey Shoot because the Japanese forces were so utterly destroyed by American aircraft and American naval forces. We'd basically learned how to protect aircraft carriers, and we more or less tore apart the Japanese attacking force before they even got close to being able to even strike at these new armored aircraft carriers. Here's an account for American forces who were fighting in the Battle of the Philippine Sea. And as you can see here, again, the Japanese Air Force was utterly decimated. And this again demonstrated the distance between the productive capacity of the United States and Japan. The United States was just so much more economically productive than the Japanese were that they were going to get swamped by materials. And so the one thing the Japanese had on their side was their willingness to fight. This is Hiro Onoda's famous testament. He was one of the soldiers who was discovered on the Philippine Islands in the 1970s. And so here's his account of this. And so because the Japanese were willing to fight to the last man, and because they were willing to launch these suicide attacks, the cost of taking these islands was extraordinarily high. Probably after the Philippine Sea, honestly, probably after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese really did not have a chance to win the war. They were looking for sort of a long shot, climatic battle to try to knock out the American fleet. The Philippine Sea was sort of an attempt at that, and they got just utterly destroyed. And so from this point onward, the Japanese are not really trying to win, but they are trying to make the war unpleasant enough to be able to negotiate theoretically better peace terms. And so on the island of Saipan, we start to see Japanese banzai attacks. These suicide attacks happening usually at night horrified Americans, and Saipan is also the first island where we started to see mass suicides of both Japanese soldiers and the civilian population. Here's an account of the banzai attacks. And so you can see here that, again, the Japanese are suffering, are taking almost 100% casualties before surrendering. And the phrase that I've heard to describe this is, if we were fighting against reasonable people, the war would be over by now. Eventually, the islands of Okinawa and Iwo Jima were both incredibly difficult islands to take. Okinawa, because, again, the Japanese defended it almost to the last man. We saw, again, suicides like we saw in Saipan. And Iwo Jima, because it's another one of those small coral atolls with tons of sort of caverns and bunkers and things like that. And so it took American Marines an incredibly long time to root out the Japanese forces there. And the casualty rates were just absolutely horrendous. From Okinawa and Iwo Jima onward, the United States then had the ability to start bombing the Japanese home islands. So here's an account of Curtis LeMay taking over our strategic bombing program. And over the course of the war, American bombers destroyed all of these Japanese cities. You can see the percentage of the Japanese city that was destroyed, and then the approximate size of the city in comparison to an American city that you might be familiar with at the time. So our takeaway is American bombers are more or less daily and nightly, round-the-clock, devastating Japanese cities, and yet the Japanese are still not giving up. They're preparing their civilian population to fight with bamboo spears if necessary, with the understanding that they will try to take as many Americans with them as possible. So that's the situation in Asia in 1944. We're also launching massive strategic bombing campaigns of Nazi Germany at this point. Again, round-the-clock bombing. American bombers are going by day, British bombers are going by night, and German, French, Polish cities are being devastated by these Allied bombing attacks. Here's an account of the firebombing of Tokyo and the effect of this, but you could read similar accounts of the firebombing of Dresden. Incendiary bombs were extraordinarily effective at wiping out cities and the civilian population. And eventually, we open up our second front in Europe. At this point, the Battle of Stalingrad has already happened. The war is mostly over for Nazi Germany. The Red Army is pushing inexorably towards Berlin. And so, to a large extent, Hitler is at this point already defeated, but we have been planning to launch an assault on German-occupied France at this point. And so we plan and launch it anyway. This is Operation Overlord, a joint American, British, and Canadian amphibious landing. We used a lot of the things that we'd learned from island hopping and a lot of the new technologies that we developed in order to try to soften up German defenses here, including, misdirection and things like that. We dropped in paratroopers behind the lines to try to attack German military positions from behind. We then launched bombing attacks on the German defenses. We launched our naval ships came in, the Navy came in and started shelling the coast, and then we actually sent the invasion in across the 5 beaches. Despite that, the fighting was still incredibly brutal, and American losses were incredibly heavy, and there was some fear that Americans were going to be stranded specifically on Omaha Beach. But in the end, we do get a foothold and begin to inexorably push the Germans back across the French countryside, liberating Paris and pushing back towards Nazi Germany. One of the things that historians have sort of struggled with is why Hitler launched his last assault against the Allies. Nazi Germany had been running out of tanks, had been running out of planes, had been running out of gas, fuel, all of this sort of stuff. And so Hitler really only had one last assault in him by 1944. And rather than attempting to slow the progress of the Red Army, which was chewing up Eastern Europe, Hitler threw his last resources at the Americans, British, and Canadians in the Ardennes Offensive, or what is known as the Battle of the Bulge. A combination of American and British troops holding key strategic points and basically the Nazis running out of fuel led to this offensive sputtering. And what we got is the race to Berlin. The Soviets get there first. In the Battle of Berlin, they take the city. Hitler commits suicide, and the Germans sack the city brutally. The treatment of the Germans by the Soviet troops was unbelievably brutal. We're not going to go into any details here, but if you're interested, you can go out and read and find resources for this. My grandfather talked about how horrified he was on going into captured Berlin, about how the Soviets had treated the Germans, and in general, Germans would look for Americans or British troops to surrender to, because if they were surrendered to the Soviets, they might just be tortured and killed. And so, yeah. Hitler falls at a huge cost to the German people. The Soviets take Berlin, and now it's time to go over to the Pacific. We had been planning, so one thing we hadn't talked about is FDR gets reelected in 44. He's running against Thomas Dewey, a Republican candidate who we're going to definitely talk more about later, and we'll spend a little bit of time on Thomas Dewey. But in 44, he's mostly a sacrificial lamb getting crushed by FDR because no one's going to change presidential candidates in the middle of the war. The plan to take on Japan itself was known as Operation Downfall, and to say that we were not particularly thrilled about the prospect of invading the Japanese home islands is a massive, massive understatement. Casualty estimates for the invasion of Japan were astronomically high, and there was a real question as to whether or not we had the wherewithal, whether or not we were willing to kill the number of civilians necessary in order to invade Japan and occupy the country. But fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on how you feel about nuclear proliferation, FDR had another option. We had been secretly developing the atomic bomb through the Manhattan Project. So here's the letter to Franklin Roosevelt. And so with FDR's death in 1945, his vice president, Harry Truman, now has a decision to make. Because he's got access to a couple atomic bombs. He could order the invasion of Japan, or he could order the use of atomic bombs against Japanese targets to try to bring the war to a close. Truman decided to use the atomic bomb for a couple different reasons. Part of it is to save American lives and to prevent a costly invasion of Japan. Part of it is the Soviets had entered the war at this point, were fighting against the Japanese in a whole bunch of different places in northern China. And the longer the war went on, the more territory the Soviets would take. Truman was much more skeptical of Stalin than FDR was, and Truman was looking at what was happening in Europe in the aftermath of Hitler's downfall and was very concerned about Soviets taking more territory in Asia. And so, in the end, we decided that we would drop the atomic bomb first on Hiroshima and then on Nagasaki. These two sites were chosen because these two cities had been left mostly untouched by traditional bombing. And so we wanted to both send a message to the Japanese about the power of these new weapons and also test the effectiveness of these weapons on potentially untouched targets. And so we dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, devastating the cities. The accounts of people here who had survived the atomic bombing are utterly horrific. I mean, any bombing is utterly horrific, but the atomic bomb, incredibly horrific because of both the explosive power, the fires, and the radiation. So here's one account of surviving the atomic bomb. Truman, of course, took full responsibility for this in a famous meeting with Robert Oppenheimer. You should definitely read this. And Truman forever changed the world. These were the only two atomic bombs to ever be dropped in wartime. This is going to start the beginning of nuclear proliferation, and with the rise of nuclear weapons, the world is going to be profoundly different. So that's how World War II in Asia came to a close. For now, we'll stop here, and then we'll talk about the post-war situation in Europe and the battles over the Iron Curtain and these things. And then after that, we'll move over to Asia, talk about the Civil War in China, the partition of Korea, the rebuilding of Japan, and some of those pieces. So for now, thank you for listening.